We're going to hear from Bridget Hard from Duke University. Bridget is a professor of practice in psychology and neuroscience and the director of undergraduate studies for psychology. And she's really devoted much of her career. She spent the last 13 years, innovating and refining curriculum for introductory psychology, both at Duke and Stanford University. She's taught introductory psychology more than 35 times, and she embeds research on teaching and learning the course directly into her curriculum. Bridget's also the founder and director of the Psychology One conference for teachers of introductory psychology. We can share that. I think it might be in the resource box, but if it's not, I'll definitely drop that in there as well. I know that conference just passed, but you may be interested in it for next year. And she's also an introductory psychology textbook author with W.W. Norton, and most relevant to today, she was also part of that intro psych initiative working group that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. So I'm thrilled and so appreciative to Bridget for being here. So please join me in welcoming her.
Hi, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen here and just make sure you all can see this. I want to highlight that you're going to see a QR code as well as a tiny URL here on this first slide. And this will take you to a Google Drive folder that contains a lot of resources that you might want to be able to access later. These include copies of the slides I'm going to share today, some articles that I'm going to mention throughout my presentation, and even just like a Google Doc that has some hyperlinks to websites and other resources that you may want to check out later. I'm sure that APA will share this with you later as well if you prefer to wait and see. But for anyone who wants to grab that QR code or the tiny URL now, you can. I'll also repeat the tiny URL a few other times throughout this presentation. So I'm super excited to see all of you today. I first just want to note that your students are all so very lucky that they have instructors who are carving time out of their summer to learn and reflect and grow as teachers of this amazing course. And I feel honored to be here to share with you some of my own approaches and insights into teaching introductory psychology. I know that my presentation is coming here at the end of several days of having to focus over Zoom. So thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. As Stu mentioned, I really specialize in teaching introductory psychology. I'm a teaching focused faculty member at Duke, and I've been teaching intro psych for 13 years, but continuously. So I've taught it 35 times. And in addition to teaching intro psych at Duke, I also do research on teaching and learning. My lab, the Bright Lab, conducts a lot of research at the intersection of psychology and pedagogy, some of which I will share with you today. All right, but first, I have a confession. When I first started teaching, I had a kind of problematic view of how teaching and learning worked. And I think this problematic view was probably slightly influenced by my background as a cognitive psychologist. Now, I don't mean to stereotype cognitive psychologists. I love cognitive psychologists, but I tended to really think a lot about the software of the mind, about the human mind as an information processing machine. And this made it really tempting to think about teaching as really a process of information transfer. And this really focused me a lot on just always trying to have the clearest, best explanation for something. If I could have a really clear explanation, then that made me an effective teacher. But as my knowledge of psychology has expanded, which it does if you teach introductory psychology, and also thanks to wonderful colleagues I've had over the years who specialize more in social psychology and clinical psychology, I've really evolved in my understanding of students. And the most important realization that I've had is that my students are not thinking and learning robots. They are complex, thinking, feeling, and socially connected creatures. And so helping them learn really requires us to take their emotions and their social connections into account. And I will say that it's this taking their emotions and social connections into account that I think has been the most impactful thing I have done as a teacher to help my course be effective. I'm particularly wanting to focus today on two key socio-emotional factors that I think are very important in teaching, especially in intro psych. The first is academic engagement. Now, this word academic engagement generally means behaviors, motivations, and emotions that are associated with academics. Some forms of academic engagement we think of as more behavioral engagement. So this might include things like how much time students spend studying, or whether they do their reading before they come to class, right? And these forms of behavioral engagement are important. but I'm particularly interested in cognitive or emotional engagement. So more like the kind of interest that students have in what they're learning. I've been particularly interested in a kind of academic engagement that you might also call something like gusto. And this is a concept that's been researched by some of my colleagues here at Duke. And it really captures this kind of feeling of excitement, of enthusiasm, of passion for the learning process. And it can be measured with questions like these. Like in college, I've found topics I'm excited and passionate about. Here at Duke, my colleagues have found that this measure of academic engagement, this kind of gusto idea, is associated with all kinds of great things in college, including better relationships with faculty, lower alcohol misuse, higher social self-efficacy, less loneliness, and even better friendship quality. And it predicts these really important outcomes far better than GPA does. So this is, I think, a very important kind of socio-emotional construct for us to understand. The second important factor is belonging. And we could think of belonging as a kind of positive emotional state that involves some sense of value, comfort, security, that's based on the perception that you belong to a group, to a community, to a place. And in lots of research, both in higher education and also in K through 12, belonging, especially in a kind of a course context, is associated with lots of great things: motivation, academic achievement, persistence, and better mental health. And so focusing on these two factors, I want to share with you a little bit today why engagement and belonging matter in intro psych specifically, some strategies that I've used in my own course to increase engagement and to increase belonging. And there's again a reminder of that tiny URL in case you want to access any resources later. So let's start by thinking about why they matter in intro psych. A few years ago, I embarked on a project with a couple of collaborators, Paula Youst, who's now a visiting faculty member at Grinnell College, and Jingshuan Liu, who's an undergrad here at Duke. And we were really interested in what predicted a successful intro psych class. But first we had to define what we meant by a successful intro psych class. And we thought, well, grades are kind of an important part of what we think of a successful class to be, in the sense that, although imperfect, if grades are part of a well-designed course, they should reflect learning, meaning that in a well-designed course, students earning higher grades usually are learning more than students earning lower grades. So we might say that like the academic achievement grades are one kind of indicator of a student's success in your class. But we also thought that intro psych, especially as a gateway to the psychology discipline, should ultimately inspire future interest in psychology, meaning that students should come out of the course wanting to take more psychology classes, or maybe even to take a deeper dive into the science of psychology, actually getting involved somehow in research. And so we were interested in what predicted these important outcomes that we associate with a good, effective course. And so we surveyed more than 500 students at Duke across 2 semesters. Now, these are Duke students. You might already be thinking about all the ways that they're peculiar compared to your students, and they are. But our students actually are relatively diverse compared to other similar institutions, mostly first years and sophomores, mostly women, very relatively few who actually plan to major or minor in psych. We have a really reasonable percentage of racial ethnic minority students, meaning they come from traditionally marginalized racial ethnic backgrounds, and almost 12% first generation college students. We had students fill out several bonus point surveys at different time points across the semester, meaning they got super modest extra credit for completing them. And we collected lots of data from these surveys that we can use both for this study and also in our class. And we measured that gusto. We measured specifically gusto in relation to our class. So students responded to questions like, in Psych 101, I have found topics I'm excited and passionate about. This is one of my favorite items here. I enjoy talking about class material with my friends outside of class. We also measured course belonging with items like these. And I put these up here so you kind of, again, have a kind of real sense of what these concepts are that I'm talking about. So students feeling welcome, feeling connected, feeling glad that they took this class, feeling like they belong. And so here's some things that we found. First of all, we found that final grades in our intro psych course were not at all correlated with future interest. So this means that students who did very well in the course are not necessarily interested in continuing in psychology, and also that some students who maybe didn't do as well as their peers in the course might be quite interested in continuing in the field. So these are really distinct outcomes in our course. We also found that belonging and gusto engagement are strongly correlated. When students are feeling a strong sense of belonging, they're also feeling a strong sense of engagement and vice versa. We found that both belonging and engagement, since they're correlated with each other, we had to pump them into a regression and control for lots of things to see how they might predict our outcomes. And we found, for example, that both belonging and engagement each uniquely predicted grades. They each accounted for significant variance in student performance. This is controlling for a lot of student demographic characteristics. So both belonging and engagement seem really important in some way, potentially in predicting how students are going to learn. But we found that engagement was particularly important in predicting future interest. Final engagement in the course, but not belonging, was uniquely predictive of students' interest in taking more psych classes and in getting involved in research. We also found, and I highlight this because this is sort of an important non-finding, we found that when we look specifically at first generation and racial minority students, we found that they did have lower grades in the course. We had an achievement gap, specifically for exams. Our first gen RM students did not do more poorly on our more supportive class assignments that had lots more structure and scaffolding, but they didn't do as well on the multiple choice midterms. However, they had equivalent belonging and engagement in our class. They had equivalent interest in taking future courses. And surprisingly, they actually showed greater interest in getting involved in research and psychology. And so one of the things that I think this suggests as we think about how we design intro is that students can experience high belonging and engagement in our class despite achievement gaps, even if they are not doing as well, and they can still feel motivated to pursue psychology. And so I think this suggests to us that although helping our underrepresented students perform well in the class is an important goal, it's not the only goal. If we can help these students to feel like they belong, to feel engaged by the material, that's going to help them persist in our field. And that, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful outcome. So given that engagement and belonging seem pretty important, how do we increase it? Let me start by sharing with you some of the ways that I try to increase engagement. And here I'm going to share a mix of science and also personal experience. I have not empirically tested all the ideas that I'm going to share with you, but I very strongly suspect that these techniques contribute to the engagement and belonging in my course. Something you might not have noticed on that earlier slide when I showed you the correlation between belonging and engagement. Belonging and engagement in my course, point of pride, are very high. They are both means above 4 out of 5. So students in my class feel very engaged. They feel like they really belong. And here are some of the ways that I try to accomplish that. All right. So let's start by thinking about how we increase engagement. Now, a lot of the strategies we use to increase engagement, I think, involve looking for ways to elicit the emotions that are associated with engagement. And one way to think of these emotions are as the knowledge emotions. This idea of the knowledge emotions is something I discovered fairly recently, within the last few years, as I was designing a different class. They are kind of a family of emotions that are all associated with learning, with exploring, with reflecting. And they include emotions like interest, which tends to motivate exploration, surprise, which tends to focus our attention, confusion, which can really motivate deeper thinking, and awe, which tends to motivate accommodation in a Piagetian sense. So like trying to transform your understanding of the world. If you want to learn more about the knowledge emotions, I strongly recommend this open source NOBA chapter from the NOBA project. I've included a copy of it in the Google Drive folder that I shared with you in case you want to check it out. I think it's super interesting and also actually kind of fun to share with students to help them think about the emotions involved in their own learning. So how do we evoke these knowledge emotions? One of the ways that I try to do it, and I encourage you to try to do it, is incorporating demonstrations and activities in your class that activate these knowledge emotions. There are so many things that we can do in our classroom, whether it's in lecture or in a discussion, some kind of other active learning, that are going to make students feel surprised, confused, awe, right? All of these important emotions can be elicited. One of the most common examples that you probably are already using in your course, visual illusions, right? There's nothing more surprising and mind-opening than these classic visual illusions that we might use when we're teaching sensation and perception. I love after effect illusions, like the color after effect. I love the Ponzo illusion to illustrate depth and how we integrate depth with retinal size when we're calculating sizes of objects. Visual illusions like trompe l'oeil, which is a kind of artistic style that means defeating the eye, or change blindness. And I've really worked to cultivate over the years, particularly striking examples of these phenomenon that will continuously, without fail, elicit a sense of surprise and awe from my students, and confusion too, confusion that makes them want to try to understand how that works. There's lots of other things we can do as well. Just one more example of something I might do in my class. I love to plant false memories for my students. And there's lots of ways that you can do this, lots of ways instructors do this. But when you're teaching about the reconstructive nature of memory, it can be really powerful to have students experience this for themselves. What I do every semester is trick students into thinking something happened on the first day of class that didn't actually happen, usually by planting some false information, some misinformation in a later lecture. I've tricked them about lots of different kinds of things. This past spring semester, because I was teaching over Zoom for my first couple of lectures, I convinced them that my dog was barking in the background on the first day of class, which was impossible because I was actually teaching in my office on campus and my dog was not there. Nevertheless, I convinced 37% of my students, as measured by a survey that I gave them, that this had happened. 37% of my students actually reported remembering this event. And most of the ones who remembered added details, like you see here. Someone thought my dog sounded like someone screaming. I laughed it off. She said she had a dog, but we would no longer get to see it, et cetera, et cetera. So they tend to remember these, and students are always very, very surprised by this, and really confused about how they could remember something that didn't actually happen. So in every lecture of my course, every lesson plan that I put together, I'm always trying to look for something that will invoke knowledge emotions, that will make students feel surprised, confused, that will make them experience a little bit of awe. And you may all have some of your favorite examples of these as well. If you do, I encourage you to share those in the chat. Share some examples that you like to do that surprise students. A second technique for increasing engagement is to really connect content to students' lives, to other disciplines, and to problems that matter to them. And I think we saw lots of examples from Catherine's presentation about ways that you can do this, right? Potentially by incorporating a DEI lens to thinking about your content, showing students how psychology is relevant to understanding issues of social justice. But there's lots of ways that we can do this. And any lesson that I design for my class, I'm often trying to think of some kind of angle like this, like what's a way that I make this content today really relevant to something students care about. So a couple of examples. When I teach cognitive psychology, particularly decision making, I really like to frame it as helping us to understand why people disagree on important social issues. And so for each concept that I'm introducing, whether it's the availability heuristic or confirmation bias, I'm framing it in terms of how this can explain why two people in the same country might disagree about gun control laws, or might disagree about the importance of Black Lives Matter or of defunding the police. So I try to make sure that the content is connecting to these issues that I know students already have an interest in and are motivated to learn about. Or social psychology can be used to help us understand how to combat climate change and to fight social injustice, right? So lots of these classic studies that we might teach in social psych can really be framed around this real world focus as well. Many aspects of psychology can help us understand how to be mentally and physically healthier. I don't know about you all, but I have a ton of students in my class who are pre-health, a lot of pre-meds, pre-nursing, pre-dentistry, all of those. And so many of the content areas in my course really involve weaving in health-related examples. So I cover things like chronic pain, how your beliefs can affect how your body processes a milkshake, how your friendships can predict whether you catch a cold or not, how knowing that you're getting a medication can amplify the benefits of that medication. So lots of different kinds of examples, and students find these surprising as well as very relevant. And then finally, to increase engagement, I think it's really important to model engagement in order to capitalize on social contagion. We all know that people's emotions can be infectious, they can be contagious. And so I think it's really important as instructors that we model the kind of gusto, the kind of engagement that we are trying to induce in students. One way to do this is to make sure that you teach content that you are genuinely excited to teach. This is really important. And I think it's one of the most beautiful things about the pillar model that the IPI has proposed. As teachers of intro psych, it's tempting to think we have to teach everything. You don't have to teach everything. We want to make sure that we are covering a smattering of ideas across different areas of psychology, right? It's important that we are showcasing psychology's breadth, but you have tremendous flexibility and choice in exactly which areas you want to showcase. And so you should choose to teach the concepts that you feel excited to teach, the things that create surprise and awe and confusion for you that you want to understand better. If you can't find an emotional angle on something that you're going to teach, you should drop it and teach something else instead, truly. I will note that it can take a while sometimes to find what excites you about certain areas that are not your areas. One of my favorite ways to discover something interesting about a topic is through podcasts. Actually, I love listening to podcasts like Hidden Brain because the journalists often do an amazing job of making psychological concepts sound fascinating. And I will usually use ideas from this podcast to find a kind of surprising or interesting angle on the content in my class. Additionally, we want to really express enthusiasm for concepts and for students' ideas. So we need to find ways to not only inside of our head do we feel enthusiastic about this, but we need to show it in our face, in our language, in our body. I have lots of like phrases that I love to use to do this. So for example, no matter what study I am about to teach you, it is my favorite. So I always love to say, let me share with you my favorite study that illustrates this concept, that illustrates the availability heuristic. It's always my favorite. There's always something I love about it, and I'm expressing that in my language. I've also said things in my class like, wow, if you are not feeling surprised by this, then you are not paying attention, because what this shows us is XYZ. So I will say that to students, trying to really show them in my body and my language how much I really think this is interesting. When I ask students for their thoughts in class, and I have discussion, even in a 360 person lecture, my students do think, pair, shares, they raise their hands, they share their ideas. It doesn't matter if I have heard a particular question or an idea 35 times, doesn't matter. When I hear it, I tell the student, that is such an interesting question. Wow, let's break that down. I want to tell you why that is such an interesting idea. And so I respond to their ideas with the same kind of enthusiasm that I want them to respond to my teaching with. And just modeling that kind of engagement, I think, is really contagious, really infectious. And one of the best things about teaching a very large class like I do is that students can also be infected by each other's engagement. So if they see other people getting interested, then they start feeling interested too. So those are some simple ideas for increasing engagement. What about belonging? Kind of two simple strategies I want to share with you. So the first is, I think it's really important when we want to help students belong to signal what psychology researchers call broad regard for identities beyond the classroom. This idea of broad regard has been studied by one of my friends and research collaborators, Eric Smith, who is at UT Austin. And he defines broad regard as really recognizing and valuing people's identities, even if they don't seem directly relevant to the current context. It's really about seeing your students as whole, complex, multifaceted people. They're not just a number in your grade book. They're not just a student in your lecture hall. They are a full, complex human being, and you appreciate and value their full humanity. This idea of broad regard is connected to lots of other related ideas in psychology, including from the healthcare domains, like affirmed care, being inclusive of true or authentic selves, identity safe practices, whole person care. These are all other terms maybe you've heard floating around in our field that are a very similar idea. So how do you signal broad regard? Because broad regard is really important. When you can signal it, and I'll show you some evidence for this, it seems to really boost students' belonging and experience. One is to describe your class components like office hours and assignments in ways that recognize students' broader lives. So let me give you an example. This is an example from a study that Eric Smith did together with myself and a few other people. This is a study we did at 2 different college campuses in one semester with 481 students. And what we did was, early on in the semester, in an ungraded section of a weekly quiz, we talked to students about office hours. And all the students saw some general encouragement about going to office hours, noting these are one of the TA's favorite parts of teaching. Students love office hours. We want to see you there. And then we had 3 different versions of a message that we shared next. So one message, like a syllabus control message, basically said the standard vague stuff about office hours that people usually put in their syllabus. Didn't really say much of anything. We had a learning focused control condition that talked about coming to chat about what you found interesting in the course. This is a place to get your questions answered, discuss psychology specifically. This will improve how you do in the course. And then critically, we did a broad goals condition where we talked about how you can essentially come to office hours to chat about anything, even if you have nothing in particular to discuss. We can help you think about how psychology can address problems you care about. This can allow us to get to know you better, right? And so we're framing office hours in a way that highlights, like, look, you're a person and we care about getting to know you as a person. We want to know what you care about, what you want to talk about, right? We just want to really nurture this relationship that we might have as teacher and student. And so what we found that was really exciting was that for non-first generation, non-racial minority students, it didn't matter what version of this message they saw, but the first generation racial minority students showed a significant increase in their course grades as a function of being in that particular condition. So we actually reduced the achievement gap in the class like significantly, simply by reframing office hours in this different way. Our first gen racial minority students also expressed having broader comfort discussing non-academic topics with their TA and other members of our teaching team. Importantly, they didn't actually go to office hours more. So they didn't actually show up more to office hours, but it was somehow the just signaling of this broad regard in the way we talked about office hours that seemed to really help our students, particularly the ones from traditionally marginalized backgrounds. So how we describe our course can communicate how we think about students. Second, we might want to really indicate that traditionally marginalized identities are particularly valued and respected in our course. This involves something we often call identity safety cues, which I mentioned earlier. Identity safety cues, there's lots of things that we do that count as identity safety. So one is just explicitly saying we value diversity and inclusion in this course. Maybe in your syllabus on the first day of class saying, this is important to me as an instructor, that we value diversity and that we make everyone feel included regardless of their background. Asking students for information that shows you value their identities, like letting students share their pronouns, sharing your own pronouns, asking students to share their name pronunciation. So particularly for students who come from backgrounds where English speakers typically mispronounce their name, having an instructor actually take the time and care to pronounce their name correctly, super valuable for showing them, hey, look, I care about your identity in this class. Also showcasing diversity as critical to rigorous psychological science. So highlighting diversity, just like Catherine mentioned, as really important in the way you teach the class. In my own class, I love to teach evolutionary psychology as one of my favorite topics to get to cover. I particularly love teaching mating psychology in my class, but it's really important since there's a lot of heterosexual bias in research on mating psychology that I bring in some diversity. And so my lesson on this topic includes sharing research on whether there are within sex differences in mating psychology as a function of sexual orientation and also a function of gender identity. Finally, we can create identity safety by using considerate language and diverse examples. So considerate language includes, when I'm talking about development and attachment, I don't just talk about mothers and fathers. I talk about caregivers more broadly because some of my students might not have had a mother or might have been adopted. And so it's really important that we're using language that is most inclusive of all students. Also making sure that your images on your screen reflect all of your students. So whenever you're showing a picture of a person, what person are you showing? Is it another really pretty young white person? Or are you showing, the race, ethnicities, the levels of ability, the ages that are reflected in your class? I think this is really important for showing students that you care about this, that you care about representing everyone. And you're also creating space for students to see themselves in psychology, to see themselves in the content, regardless of their identity. There's a really great study that just came out in Teaching of Psychology by Hovansky et al. That actually tested these identity safety cues in a social psych class and found, and this is a quasi-experimental design, but they found that students in the identity safety cues class reported higher course belonging, and they also attended class more regularly compared to the control classroom. There's at least some initial evidence that this actually does boost belonging, as well as things I mentioned earlier, like grades and how comfortable students are talking to you. So one more quick thing to share about strategies for increasing belonging is simply cultivating community. Trying to make sure that your classroom is a space where students can actually have meaningful interaction with each other, such as even in a large lecture hall, creating space for students to talk with each other, to share ideas with one another. And when you're doing that, making sure that you're encouraging inclusiveness. So for example, things I love to say to students when we do this in my class, hey, before you get started, take time to remind each other of your names. Make sure to really listen to each other. I really want us to build on each other's ideas. Or things like, if you see someone without a partner or a group, invite them to join you. Let's be inclusive. Using language like this, it's encouraging students to really connect with each other, highlighting that these relationships are meaningful in our class is also a great way to cultivate some belonging. And then one, I promise, last thing to mention about this is I think in my own class, I think many classes around the country are finding ways to also harness other undergraduates as peer mentors and leaders in order to help cultivate community. My own intro psych class actually has small discussion sections of 12 or 13 students that are each led by an undergrad. These undergrads at Duke are called the Costanzo Teaching Fellows. They are actually paid as TAs for the class, and they're part of a special teacher training program that I take them through. But other universities have had undergrads serve in this kind of role for course credit. That's free. Or have had them play less formal roles as like learning assistants, where they might host some office hours or field student questions, help organize study sessions. And I have found in my experience that involving undergrads is just so powerful for really cultivating that sense of community in your class because they're so close to that student experience themselves. They often really are very motivated to create a supportive environment for their younger classmates. And they really know all kinds of great ways to connect psychology to students' everyday lives because they themselves are students. So I have these teaching fellows not only lead their own discussion sections, but they also sit in on all of my lectures and they give me continuous feedback every single class on how welcoming and inclusive this class was. What was the diversity of examples like? Are there ways that we can showcase more diversity? Are there things that I said that were not as considerate as they should have been? And they have really helped me tremendously over the years to make my class feel like a really engaging and welcoming space. And so when I ask students in my class to report what made our class feel welcoming, inclusive or not, students reflect back these ideas to me. So this is like not the best evidence, but some informal anecdotal evidence from students that they notice things like we include all types of people in our examples. They point out when studies in the past weren't inclusive. They love that we affirm minority struggles from a psychological perspective. They love that we use appropriate and considerate language. They love seeing their TF in section or in class and waving to them. They love their undergrad TF. They love the interactivity in class. They get to engage and collaborate with people. They love that we speak about important social issues, marginalized communities, and then we ask them to include each other in their discussions. All right, so some take homes, and then I can't wait to hear your questions. First of all, I think a successful intro psych course should cultivate engagement and belonging. It's not just about getting students to like ace the exam or not fail the exam, maybe in some cases. It's really about getting them fired up and feeling some passion and gusto for what our field has to offer and feeling like they belong in our classroom communities. We can encourage engagement by selecting activities and content to activate and model those knowledge emotions. And we can encourage belonging by signaling broad regard and by cultivating community. So here again is that tiny URL and that QR code if you want to grab those. I'll give you just a beat on those. And I'm excited to hear your questions.